Welcome to Highway to Space, where we explore the human side of our cosmic journey. Today's guest is a trailblazer at the intersection of anthropology, religion, and space exploration. Dr. Deana Weibel is a space anthropologist, chair of the Chicago Great Lakes chapter of the Explorers Club, and co-organizer of Roger Dat in Grand Rapids. Her groundbreaking research examines how sacred beliefs shape and are shaped by humanity's push beyond Earth. From studying pilgrimage sites like Rocamadour to interviewing NASA astronauts and Vatican astronomers, Dr. Weibel's work asks, how will religion evolve as we settle the moon, Mars, and beyond? She's also the author of A Sacred Vertigo and is currently writing The Ultraview Effect. Deana, welcome to the show.
Thank you very much.
The sacred and the cosmic, Deana. Your work compares earthly pilgrimage sites to space exploration. How do concepts of sacred space translate to environments like the ISS or future lunar habitats?
I think sometimes there's a couple ways to think about it. One is that it seems like it's a dramatically different kind of situation. I know a lot of people I've spoken to have been surprised that there are any religious aspects to space. In fact, occasionally in chats online, people have gotten very angry that I'm somehow inserting the idea of religion into space. So the idea of space versus religion, space being in the realm of science, religion being something more spiritual, something more earthly, definitely not something scientific. But when you look at it, there's a couple things that I always keep in mind. Number one, the language we use to describe things that are not earthly is very much the same in a lot of cases for both religion and for space exploration. So, for instance, people refer to the sky as the heavens, or they talk about something being celestial. If I told you I went outside and I heard an unearthly noise, am I talking about a spaceship landing or am I talking about a choir of angels, right? So there's this contrast with how we live on Earth, what we expect, but then also this idea of wonderment and amazement and awe that people feel both in religious contexts and when thinking about outer space.
Mm. You've written about NASA's rituals or astronaut the rituals for the astronaut reintegration. Why are ceremonies vital for space communities? And could we see new ones emerge? For instance, let's say Mars settlers.
Absolutely. I am 100% sure that we will. So humans are, if you look at every human society around the world, there and in the past and in the present, and we can extrapolate this into the future as well, you have the idea that there are changes that happen in society. A lot of times these changes we associate with things like biology. A baby's born and we need a ritual to mark that. A child becomes an adult and we need a ritual to mark that. Two people or more marry and we need rituals to mark that. Somebody dies and we need rituals to mark that. So that idea of marking changes in status is something that anthropologists study and something that all human societies do. One of the things that I've written about had to do with Butch Wilmore and Sonny Williams, who were supposed to be on a very short trip up to the International Space Station on the Boeing Starliner. Obviously, they did not return on the Starliner, and what started as a trip that was just a matter of days ended up being several months long. And there was a lot of concern about that because normally when a new crew arrives, there are certain things that are supposed to happen, including sort of their integration into the larger group. And that didn't happen with Sonny and Butch. Instead, they were just sort of there without enough food. They had to make do. There was like meals that were rationed they were eating other people's food until more food could be set up. They had to kind of use other people's clothes. They didn't fit into the situation until there were resupply ships that came up. But the idea of making Sunita Williams commander kind of shifted that, because you have rituals that welcome a new commander. And so once that happened, it was like resetting the entire situation. She went from being kind of a stray person to being in charge. And that gave her a new status. The ritual of ringing the bell happened. This idea of moving into a new space where she had a named position. And of course, Butch was part of her team. And so they became integrated, but you needed to have something marking that. And marking an event rather than just letting it happen seems to be a way that humanity sort of gives permission for change to happen. And so we're a lot more comfortable when change is accompanied by some kind of ritual.
I see. Now, let's stick to this faith versus science aspect. Your 2019 sabbatical included Jesuit astronomers and NASA scientists. How do these professionals reconcile faith with science, and does their work ever feel spiritually interconnected?
Definitely. I mean, okay, so obviously among the mainstream NASA scientists I talk to, not all of them are religious. There are quite a few people at NASA who might have been raised in a religious tradition but no longer practice it, who might still feel that they're part of something larger, working for NASA, working to help humanity kind of expand into space or learn more about space. But there are quite a few. It's one of those things where I sometimes tell people, it's like you think you're alone in the forest and then you pick up a rock and there's all kind of life crawling around underneath. That's maybe a bad metaphor. But if you pick up the rock, that's where you find where the life is. And I think by doing these interviews with people who don't normally get asked about religion, I was able to uncover information that was not obvious, that was not on the surface, that you had to pick up something to look under it. And so with mainstream NASA scientists, engineers, people at JPL, APL, some of them might not have been religious in an explicit way, but a lot of what was going on with them was an awareness that they didn't know everything there was to know. One particular engineer I remember talking to, I call him Cody in my book that's coming out, the Ultraview effect book. He talks about how, he was raised in a religious tradition and he doesn't follow it any longer, but he's not going to say there is not some power behind the universe because he just doesn't know. And the more research that he does, he still doesn't know. And so his willingness to accept incomplete information allows him to take in more information. And it was almost a spiritual stance that he was taking, kind of almost a holy agnosticism, if you want to call it that. Mm. Now, with the Vatican Observatory, on the other hand, it was a little bit different because obviously these are folks who are part of religious orders. Most of them are Jesuits. They are very strong believers, and they've dedicated themselves, whether as brothers or priests, to be members of religious communities. And so from their perspective, there was a sense that they did truly believe in God, that God was present in their lives, that God was sort of leading them into the careers they chose, but also that studying space, whether black holes or galactic lensing or lensing in other ways, or meteorites, that they were able to see the structure of the universe created by the God they believed in, and felt strongly that this was a way to know God. And there was a really interesting reinforcement mechanism I noticed where the more they discovered through their peer-reviewed, scientific, published in journals research, the more they felt that they were understanding that God was present as a creator behind the universe. And the more religious ritual they participated in, the more they felt sure of God's presence. And it made, in their case, studying science didn't take anything away from their religious beliefs. It contributed to it, and it kind of started this reinforcing cycle that I thought was really fascinating.
Yeah, and you mentioned your upcoming book, The Ultraview Effect. We had on the show Frank White, who talked about the overview effect. Now, your upcoming book contrasts the ultraview effect with the overview effect. Can you define it, and how might it reshape our understanding of human resilience in deep space?
Absolutely. Well, first of all, I named what I was hearing about, the Ultraview effect, as kind of a tip of the hat to Frank White, because his overview effect concept is something that's very real. Not every astronaut I've interviewed has had a strong experience seeing the Earth from space, but the vast majority of them have. And this idea of looking at something in a new way, from a perspective that humans haven't had before the 20th century, is something that I really felt was in line with the ultraview effect. So let me explain how that came about. I have an astronaut that I interviewed starting around 2017, and I call him Zach in my publications because as an anthropologist, I'm not at liberty, as a journalist would be, for instance, to use people's real names. I follow the Institutional Review Board, it's human subjects research, and part of what I have to do is make sure that I'm protecting the confidentiality of the people I interview. Because if they're telling me things about their religious beliefs, their spirituality, things maybe they wouldn't want other people to know, I have to make sure that they're not being exposed in ways that could cause them harm. So I was talking with Zach, not his real name, and he started telling me about being in deep space. I have to say, and this narrows it down to who Zach is, but he was in orbit around the moon, and he got into a deep shadow for a temporary period of time where he was not he was protected from the light reflecting from the moon, the light reflecting from Earth. It was very dark. He was out of communication with NASA, and he was by himself. And he turned off all the lights in his spacecraft and looked out the window. And we talked about this over several interviews. He was really amazed by what he saw. He said there were so many stars, he couldn't actually see between them. It was more like a solid sheet of light. And it threw off his understanding of reality in a way that was long-lasting. So it amazed him in the moment, but he had to go back to work. Obviously, astronauts are always busy. They're always chasing the red line, as they say. There's a checkoff list they have to follow. But when he got back to Earth, he told me about staying up late at night and thinking about what he had seen and what it meant and how he was writing and trying to figure out how there could be that many stars. And he began to do research to understand what he saw and got very much involved in things like the Drake equation, where there are so many stars that even if the tiniest percentage, I think he told me, if even just 0.00001% had life, that's still millions, maybe billions of, planets that would have life. Like, the numbers are just so sheer. And he also explained that when you are in space and you don't have the atmosphere that we get when we look at the Milky Way from Earth, it's different. There's a reason we put telescopes out in space, right? We don't want that interference through the atmosphere, through Earth's light. So seeing stars from space with the naked eye was really impressive. And I thought, wow, this is amazing. So I kind of kept track of that, but I didn't have a name for it. And eventually I settled on the Ultraview effect kind of as a corollary of the overview effect, because it's looking out into space, right? The ultra, the scale is so much bigger, obviously, than the Earth. And then I first gave a presentation at the American Anthropological Association meetings in 2018 in San Jose, California. It was a panel called Ethnographies of the Extreme. So that's where I first used the term ultraview effect. And then I published on it later. But in the meantime, I met another astronaut I call Theo. And Theo was somebody who kind of, if I put it frankly, kind of chased spiritual experiences in space. He really felt that space was a spiritual place and did things like meditated in microgravity and participated in religious rituals of the people around him while he was in space. But he wanted to look out and see the stars while dark adapted. And it was difficult for him to do so. There were missions where people refused to turn the lights off, for instance, and you can't do it by yourself. It's so hard to get the right conditions to see the stars unaided in dark from space. But eventually he was able to do that. And he said it was a solid white wall. It was just, it really echoed what Zach had told me, that there's no space between them. You're looking right into the Milky Way. And he said it was an incredible spiritual experience, and that spiritual experiences are as necessary to astronauts as food and water. And he really believed that it's something that should be provided for in space missions.
So powerful. Deana, I would like to touch base with some ethics of space tourism now. That's because after the Titan submersible tragedy, you wrote about extreme tourism. Is commercial spaceflight a modern pilgrimage, or does it risk commodifying the sacred?
Yes, both of those. It's full of contradictions. And obviously, when people are making a decision to go up into space as a spaceflight participant, obviously, a lot of people don't like the word tourist, because tourist sounds like you're doing something not serious, something that's just for fun. And a lot of people who go up into space, even if it's for, like they're in microgravity for just 4 minutes or something, they try to bring experiments with them, or they try to make sure that they're being monitored. So there's a seriousness to it in some cases. In other cases, it's just a chance to flip yourself upside down and look out the window and, float something that you brought with you.
And make a selfie.
Right, and take a selfie, obviously, yes. I think everybody has to take a selfie at this point, but we see astronauts on the ISS taking selfies all the time, too. So that's just part of 21st century culture, I guess. I think it's fascinating because obviously the public is a little upset with the way that how being an astronaut has changed because of these kinds of, I'm thinking of Blue Origin, I'm thinking of Virgin Galactic, I'm thinking of some of the SpaceX flights. When it's a suborbital hop and it's so brief and people are paying for it, a lot of the public gets upset because they're used to thinking of space flight as something the elite get to do, and not the elite in terms of wealth, but the elite in terms of brawn and brains. Somebody who has passed all the tests. People watch movies like The Right Stuff and watch people being spun around and exposed to different kinds of difficulties, and they survive it all, and they're sort of these prime examples, more than mortal human beings. And if that has gone by the wayside and we're now sending people up in space because they earned money on records that they publish or, music that they've done, I'm thinking of Katy Perry because she was such a lightning rod for criticism, which was, in my opinion, it was completely over the top and so strange. It really surprised me. The idea being that somehow pop stars who go into space, broadcasters who go into space may not deserve to be there under the old rules. That being said, from my perspective, it is a spiritual experience. It is something that's meaningful because what they're experiencing is what they're floating in space. They're seeing Earth from the outside. All of these things that are overwhelming. And if I were to compare it to pilgrimage on Earth, I'm trying to think like Lourdes is a relatively well-known site of pilgrimage that I've been to many times. And Lourdes has got the water that you drink. It's got this sort of beautiful basilica. There are processions. Thousands of people come at the same time and they pray together. And it's this sense of being somewhere that's very special and somewhat overwhelming. And space obviously is very different from that, but it still has that symbolic gravitas, that meaningfulness of it. And so when you put somebody in that situation, no matter how they got there, even if they're not religious, the symbolism of it and the sense of the rarity of it and the reality of seeing something like the overview effect, where you're looking at the Earth from space, that's not something that looking at a picture can give you from what everybody who's had that experience says. And so how could it not be a spiritual experience? And one of the things that I've been fascinated by is astronauts in general are expected to be military-like in the way that they present themselves. There are a few exceptions. Thinking of Chris Hadfield, playing music in space, and you'll get images of astronauts doing fun things like, playing with their food or whatever. But this idea that you are disciplined and that you've earned your way into space because you know how to work hard and you can take suffering and you can, sacrifice things in order to get this experience. They're not as expressive in general about what it's like as space tourists, especially not if they're active astronauts. Active astronauts are so afraid of losing their next mission that I've had astronauts refuse to talk to me about certain topics at all. It's like, no, I don't want to lose my chance to fly. I'm not going to discuss that. And so I think commercial space travel is bringing people into space who don't have that regimented military style way of interacting with the public and interacting in space, which frees them up to have experiences in space that professional astronauts never did.
Indeed, and that's so true. Deana, you've highlighted in your work NASA's ties to the Vatican Observatory. What lessons can space agencies learn from centuries-old institutions about long-term vision and ethics?
It's an interesting question. The Vatican Observatory is a fascinating place to visit. They do have a guest apartment, and I was able to stay there for a month between mid-March and mid-April 2019. And the lower story of this building, it's not an old building. It was built after World War II. It's actually a new building that they're in. The lower floor looks very much like a college department. Like if you were in a physics department at a university, there's offices, they've got their computers, they've got, art on the walls, or in some cases, 3D printers, and stuff that they're doing, experiments. There's a break room. The break room has a cappuccino maker, and a member of the staff is there, making the cappuccinos. People will bring pastries if they have a journal article published. There's a lot of this idea of it being a workplace. The upstairs is where people have their private rooms. There's a dining room upstairs. And so there's kind of that contrast. And even though the building itself is new, the Vatican Observatory has existed since the late 1800s. It is funded by the Vatican. And one of the interesting things about that is it doesn't rely on changing priorities to the extent that, say, the American space program does. So NASA, whoever the president is, gets to sort of set the agenda. And Congress gets to vote on things. So you have one party in power, it goes a certain way. A different party in power, it goes a different way. Because they don't have to rely on government funding of the same kind, obviously it's government funding from the Vatican, but they also don't have to rely on grants. the Vatican Observatory scientists are able to take very long-term longitudinal projects. It's not like they have a research cycle where they have to produce something by a certain date and then it flips over. And so it was explained to me that this allows them to move at a slower pace in a way that can be really beneficial. And a lot of what they do is backup research for other people's project. So if somebody's studying, the OSIRIS-REx mission to Bennu, you have a Vatican scientist who might be studying the properties of the sample that they brought back. But that person may not be under the same limits of time or fear of losing funding that other people may have. So I think one of the things that can be learned from that kind of contrast is just what it looks like to do research at a slower pace that allows it to be less rushed and perhaps in some ways more careful, and to have that long-term view and that confidence that you're going to be able to continue to work on your project 5 years in the future, for instance.
Exactly. It's so interesting, everything you're saying. I'm so thrilled to have you on the show. I'm just aware that the time flies by. I just want to focus on a question I wanted to ask about your work, Sherpas on the Moon, where you argue for native guides in space.
Kind of.
Who might fill that role, and how do we? And I think that's the most important. How do we avoid colonial pitfalls in extraterrestrial settlements?
Yeah, this is a big ethical question. It's something I've just been revising the Ultraview Effect book and going through some of these big, difficult issues that we're going to have to deal with. Okay, so the Sherpas on the Moon it came from two sources in terms of my ideas, and it's meant facetiously. Obviously, I know there's not an indigenous population living on the moon, but there is a satirical newspaper called The Onion, and they had an article about how the Sherpa that led Neil Armstrong to the moon had passed away, and they created this entire parody of the Mount Everest, climbs where Sir Edmund Hillary went up with Tenzing Norgay, and the idea that the Sherpas already were comfortable going to the mountain and only brought the European or New Zealander person with them as kind of a way for the West to feel like they'd done something that nobody had done before. And they played around with that idea, with the idea that traditionally Sherpas were going to the moon, but this time they brought Neil Armstrong. And it was just one of those things that struck me as very funny the first time I saw it. And at the same time, I went to something called the Tennessee Valley Interstellar Workshop in 2019 it was actually in Wichita, Kansas, and I was with a panel of other people, including another anthropologist, a linguist, a philosopher, I think 2 philosophers, and we were just kind of talking as part of the panel about who you would want to bring to Mars. And the joke that came up was, if you were bringing dogs, you wouldn't just want to bring one breed of dog. This is kind of, the taste of this is a little bit questionable. But the point of it is that you don't want just one culture up there. And that's sort of what's been happening, is there's this tradition since the 1960s of more European, Western type culture sort of being who goes into space. Obviously, there are exceptions, but 80% of NASA astronauts right now are white men. It's pretty homogeneous. And so my argument in Sherpas on the Moon was that, okay, well, let's look at the Sherpas who have this experience traveling in mountains and understanding what it's like to live in low oxygen environments. Why aren't we recruiting astronauts from populations that have experience with the kinds of things we'll need to do in space, rather than thinking of it in terms of who's got the money? which is how it's done now, why not think about, are there populations that, for instance, because of where they live, might not need as much oxygen as somebody who was from Kansas might? Or are there populations that have a cultural background of quick decision making or handling issues that are going to come up in space? One of the people that I was involved with at the conference that I just mentioned, and now I'm going to blank on her name, but she's a linguist, and she was born without sight. And she's made the argument in some of her work that maybe because we have things like, sands, the fluid in your body will build up and cause pressure on your eyes, and some astronauts end up with vision that never returns to its normal state. One of the astronauts I spoke to, Theo, the one who has a lot of spiritual experiences in space, he was talking about how often they need to have cataract surgery because of the radiation they're exposed to. And this researcher, this linguist, she was saying, okay, well then why not send up people who are already blind, who've already learned how to accommodate a lack of sight? We're all going to be disabled in space. And I thought that was interesting. So the idea of not thinking about who has the money, who has the physical attributes that we admire on Earth, but people who have skills and abilities that might fit into space that might not be recognized by the people who make the decisions about who goes into space. So I think I kind of went on a tangent there, but hopefully that answered your question.
Yeah, absolutely. Now you're mentioning the linguist person. You're a linguist yourself, and as a linguist myself, I am very sensible to it. You speak how many languages? You speak French, Spanish, and Italian, is that true?
I tried to learn a little Italian. I didn't get very far with my Italian. I did study it ahead of going to the Vatican Observatory, but English is the language mostly spoken there. And how do I put this? I spent a lot of time in France doing my field work at Rocamadour, and I do speak French pretty fluently. But in Italian, there wasn't an expectation that my Italian would be perfect, whereas in France, there was an expectation that my French should be perfect. Just a very different kind of cultural view about people speaking the language. And so my French got very good. My Italian didn't quite. I was only there for 2 months. What I was picking up on quickly was Portuguese. I was able to go down to International Space University, was having a summer event, although it was winter down there. But in any case, they do something usually in the Northern Hemisphere summer that students, and they're professionals, they're not students or undergraduate students, but it's a chance to learn more about space and be around other people. And so there was an event for that in Brazil, and I was able to go down there. I do think that my Portuguese was moving pretty quickly in Brazil, and if I'd been able to stay longer, I probably would have picked it up. Brazil came more naturally than Italian to me.
Yeah. You mentioned Rocamadour in France.
Yes.
And it's, well, to me, it's a place I know very well. And I know that objects like the Black Madonna became sacred just throughout the pilgrimage. And I'm asking, could everyday items, so for instance, I don't know, a Mars rover bolt, gain sacred status in space? And how?
I think so. I mean, one of the things that often we make things sacred because of their history. So if something is really old and something has been valued for a long period of time, that makes a difference. So the Black Madonna of Rocamadour, when you have an object like a statue of the Virgin Mary with Jesus that has been venerated and valued for centuries, so much so that it changes to, it becomes black in color because of smoke from incense, from candles, from silver tarnishing, and it's still valued. People see that and they feel like if other people valued this, it must be valuable. I think there's a lot being done right now. Alice Gorman is a good example of this, looking into heritage of things in space. You have the Apollo moon landing sites. Are those going to be protected? Are they going to be something that we keep? Or is that going to be discarded as we move forward? And I have a feeling that Martian rovers, other objects that can sort of stay in stasis may become very powerful symbolically and take on a status of being pilgrimage destinations if humans can get up there. I mean, a lot of what we consider pilgrimage doesn't necessarily have a religious component. I'm thinking, for instance, there's some famous work that's done about Elvis Presley's home, Graceland, where Elvis Presley isn't necessarily a religious figure. For some people, he's kind of taken on that role. But even if you are a completely secular person who loves Elvis Presley's music, going to his home and being where he was and being in those locations becomes extremely important. People feel that way about battlefields. Gettysburg is a good example from the United States again, where because of what happened there, I was recently at the site where the Twin Towers that were, that fell during 9/11. And that place is very much a sacred place, the way that people treat it, the way that people act there. And so it wouldn't surprise me at all if objects, if we keep them safe, if they have strong symbolic value and if people can reach them, will be considered sacred objects. At the same time, people are talking about decommissioning the International Space Station. And there are folks in sort of space archaeology who are like, it would be wonderful to save that if there was a way. Can't we keep it? Can't we do something with it so that people can go there and people can study it? But the practicality of that is very difficult. How do you get something that size back down without it burning up? And NASA so far hasn't seemed convinced that salvaging it is worth anything. But obviously, if it were something that people could visit, even on Earth, it would be extremely meaningful.
Yeah, yeah. And as I was saying, I was so much looking forward to this discussion, and there are so many questions I have prepared, but I won't be able to go through all of them. I just want to honor our followers Q&A. It's a custom in our show to finish with a few questions from our followers, and they sent us the questions since we announced this episode coming up. And I picked up one of these questions is from, they call themselves Anthropology Nerd 23.
Okay.
Right. So Anthropology Nerd says, your work spans French shrines to SpaceX. What unites these seemingly disparate worlds?
Well, some of that I hope I've covered. The idea of it being important, the idea of it being more than just earthly. So when people go to Rocamadour and they see the statue of the Virgin, the black, la Vierge Noire, there are miracles associated with the statue. There is a bell, as I'm sure you know, in the chapel that has a legend that it rang when somebody was saved from shipwreck, if they prayed to the Virgin Mary to save them. And if the bell rang, then the monks would write down the time and the date and wait for that person to come and pay their respects and their thanks for being saved at sea. That idea that there is what Victor and Edith Turner called a tear in the veil between this world in the next. So we have kind of two worlds, the spiritual world and the mundane world. And places like Rocamadour are places where they connect, where you can see from one into the other. SpaceX is doing something very similar, right? Especially with their missions like the Axiom ones or Jared Isaacman's Polaris Dawn and Inspiration 4 missions. You're taking people who are Earth people up into space where, once again, they're able to see, for a few days or in suborbital cases for a few minutes, the other place, the space. So we have the world contrasted, like the ordinary world contrasted with something that's more than ordinary. And I think both pilgrimage and space travel are putting ordinary folks in a situation where they're moving from one to the other and they're able to see both. And I think that is particularly fascinating and one of the main through lines that connects those two areas of research.
Deana, thank you so much for this stellar conversation.
You're very welcome.
Your work reminds us that space isn't just about rockets and space flights. It's also about the rituals, the beliefs, and stories we will carry out with us up there. Folks, follow Dr. Weibel's work at deanaweibel.space and grab her book, A Sacred Vertigo. For Highway to Space, I'm Dan Trothier. Please subscribe for more deep dives into humanity's next giant leap. Until next time, keep looking up.
Setting our sights on worlds near and far. With every conversation, we're breaking new ground. In the heart of exploration, our dreams are profound. From Mars to the cosmos, we'll make our stand, unraveling mysteries with a hopeful hand. We're joined by the dreamers, the pioneers of fate. Together we'll chart what awaits us in space. On the highway to space, we'll soar ever high. With our hearts full of wonder, let's reach for the sky. In this journey together, we're lighting the way. The future of exploring is ours here today. With astronauts guiding and artists in tow, scientists dreaming where the wild clouds flow. Each guest tells a story, each voice has a spark, as we forge our path through the shadows and dark. The search for new life and the tales yet untold. In the theater of space, our adventures unfold, inspiring the youth with stars in their eyes. The next generation will claim their own skies. On the highway to space, we'll soar ever high. With our hearts full of wonder, let's reach for the sky. In this journey together,